Though it took far too long to get started, the abolitionist movement started in earnest in the early 19th century, so the 1800s, really more so around 1810, 1820. And an abolitionist was somebody who wanted to bring an end to that evil, peculiar institution known as slavery, where enslaved peoples were forced to do work against their will and often were mistreated and dehumanized. So primarily, whites in the North and free blacks in the North were the head of this movement, but there were also some individuals, some caring individuals in the South, particularly free blacks and abolitionist whites, who saw that slavery was dehumanizing and that these human beings, these individuals, deserved a lot better. Now, even though the abolitionist movement really started to pick up a lot of positive momentum, there were some Northern mill workers who were opposed to abolitionist goals for selfish reasons of fear that enslaved peoples who were freed, now being cheaper laborers potentially, might take their jobs. Even though they would get paid, these primary mill workers in the North and factory workers were fearful and concerned that they might lose out to cheaper laborers. Many Southerners were noticeably against abolition because they feared it would severely damage their Southern economy. In other words, they wouldn't make as much money. They would have to pay their workers now. And if slavery was abolished and made illegal, the majority of the people who were enslaved were more than likely going to flee and move to the North and get away from the tension and from the evils that they experienced in the South. So not only would Southerners have to pay for their laborers, but it would be hard to come by some new laborers, some new workers, because of the fact that they had created some of that tension. So who were some of the famous abolitionists? One of them was John Brown. Now, John Brown was somebody who in 1859 raided a weapons arsenal at Harper's Ferry. In other words, he rounded up a group of supporters of the abolitionist movement, and they broke into a federal gun locker and storage unit and basically took those weapons to use force and threats and intimidation to get Southerners to free their slaves or to agree to bring an end to slavery. His intention was to organize this armed rebellion, and he was caught and put to punishment for that, but it at least opened the eyes of many people who were pro-abolition and anti-slavery. There was also the Underground Railroad, led by people like William Still and Harriet Tubman. Now, Tubman helped over 300 slaves escape from freedom, or escape to freedom, on this Underground Railroad. And of course, it was not an actual railroad. It was a secret organization that illegally helped slaves escape to freedom in the North through this system of hidden routes and basically leaving at nighttime, covered by darkness when people were sleeping, and also when it was difficult for anybody to see anything. And even though it was kind of exaggerated in myth, there were some places that had hiding houses or secret passages, whether it's in a shed or inside their home or in wagons, where escaped slaves could hide until, during the daytime, until they could continue at night. But a lot of times they were either hiding themselves in crop fields or in water or in areas where they had some cover. Now, Tubman's work in the Underground Railroad helped people in the North realize that slavery should be abolished. So when people were risking their lives and when people were risking being arrested, because in 1850 there was something passed called the Fugitive Slave Law, which basically made it illegal to help or aid in any slave or enslaved person escaping to freedom. This was a risky venture, but because people in the North started to hear that people were risking their right to life and their well-being to help out enslaved persons, that made them think, well, things must be really bad if people are risking their safety, their health, their livelihood in order for this cause. Michigan citizens especially helped slaves to escape by harboring them in their places of residence until those escaped slaves could either get to an area of freedom or could get to Canada, where they were out of the country altogether. And Michigan was a common ending point or stopping point for many escaped slaves who were leaving from southern states like Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, even in some of those middle states where slavery still existed. Many freed blacks would set up new lives in Michigan, and so there was kind of a greater migration of escaped individuals coming to freedom and starting a new life and developing their own roots here in the Midwestern states like Michigan, but also Illinois and other surrounding areas. And the resistance of enslaved people increased sectional tensions between the North and the South. So we continue to see the issue of slavery, the difference of opinion and the difference in principle between North thinking that slavery should be illegal and these were human beings that deserve their right to life to be observed, and Southerners considering them property and considering them, a necessary involvement in their way of life in the South and as a part of the Southern economy. And it's easy for us to look at that from a 21st century lens, but you look back at the tension that it created between the North and the South at that time, it was really an argument between right to life and right to property. Another abolitionist who really helped the cause was Sojourner Truth, an escaped slave born into slavery and given the name Isabella Baumfree. Once she escaped and gained her freedom and earned it as a hero, she changed her name to Sojourner Truth, which translates into traveler speaking God's truth. So to sojourn, the root word journey is in there. So she journeyed and she traveled to speak the truth that enslaved individuals were taken against their will and were denied their right to life. And they were human beings. They were people who had feelings, who had human connections and emotions, and deserved as much a right to life as any other human being walking the planet Earth. She felt she was sent by God to spread the truth about God's thoughts against slavery. And she and other abolitionists said that slavery is making God angry. And, that appealed to a lot of Christians at the time, a lot of people who were religious by nature and felt if I want to make the Christian God happy, then I'm going to maybe follow the truths that this woman and other abolitionists are speaking. She also spoke for women's rights as well. Two other abolitionists who not only helped out with the cause to end slavery, but also partnered with the women's rights movement to speak about equal treatment and improvement for women were Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison. Now, Douglass was an escaped slave, or a freed slave, I should say, and spoke of his experiences and his past connections with a life in slavery and published a few slave narratives, and in addition was an editor for the North Star, an abolitionist publication in the northern areas. And so when people spoke of his primary source, firsthand testimony of what it was like as a slave in his many experiences, they really took wind of that. And people went so far as to not believe that Douglass was once a slave because of how well educated he was. And the common thought was that most slaves who were denied the right to education and denied the right to literacy would not be able to speak as eloquently as Douglass did, and were not able or did not have the education that Douglass exuded. And so that's where Douglass is one of my favorite Americans of all time, because of the fact that not only was he so well accomplished and he earned it and he did all the hard work about as tough as you could get, but it was so profound at that time and it was so unbelievable at that time because of the fact that many like him and who had a similar past experience that he did, it was unlikely that they were going to reach such heights that he did. But he was a pioneer. He paved the way for many like him, and is truly a hero, not just for the Black community, but for all Americans and really all human beings alike. And then Garrison was a white activist who was also a newspaper publisher. He published something called The Liberator, which again was an anti-slavery newspaper and really promoted the abolitionist cause and spoke out and talked negatively and really took shots at Southern slave owners and pro-slavery people who wanted to keep around that institution. So these were just some of the many abolitionists and some of the many great stories. But I highly encourage you to go and look online, look up some of the other abolitionists, some of the other great stories like Ellen Craft, Henry Box Brown, David Allen Walker. These are just a few of the people who contributed to the abolitionist cause and had some pretty remarkable stories along the way.